They laughed when they handed me the notice. Not an angry laugh. Not nervous. It was casual, confident, like they were swatting a fly. $300, printed neatly at the bottom, for a violation I supposedly committed at my own lake house. I remember standing there, water glittering behind them, boats drifting peacefully, while the HOA board members smiled like the outcome was already decided. In that moment, they believed I was cornered. I bought that lake house years earlier, pouring everything into it. $5 million worth of glass, stone, and silence. It was my escape. My reward. The kind of place where mornings felt slow and evenings felt earned. The HOA had always existed, but they were background noise. Rules about paint colors, dock hours, trash cans. Annoying, but harmless. Until that notice. They claimed a minor modification violated community standards. A dock extension, measured differently depending on who held the tape. $300 wasn't the issue. Control was. When I questioned it, they mocked me. One of them even said, "Just pay it." Everyone does. That sentence mattered more than they realized. I went home angry, but not reckless. I didn't argue in emails. I didn't post online. Instead, I did something they never expected. I opened the HOA documents. Not the summary. Not the welcome packet. The full, boring, ignored bylaws. Hundreds of pages. Amendments stacked on amendments. Language written decades ago by lawyers who assumed no one would ever read it carefully. Most people wouldn't. I did. Somewhere between outdated fee schedules and forgotten voting procedures, I found it. A clause buried so deep it felt intentional. It wasn't dramatic. No bold text. No warning. Just a quiet paragraph describing how authority shifted if certain conditions were met. Conditions the HOA had been ignoring for years. My hands actually shook when I realized what it meant. This wasn't about erasing a fine. This wasn't even about my house anymore. If this clause applied, the entire power structure of the lake community could change. Not hypothetically. Legally. I replayed every interaction in my head and saw them differently. The smiles. The shortcuts. The confidence. They weren't powerful. They were careless. They had built control on routine, not rules. And routine only works until someone slows down enough to question it. Over the next few days, I documented everything. Missed filings. Improper notices. Votes taken without quorum. Every shortcut they took because they thought no one was watching. No one except me. What started as a small notice quietly became the most important legal discovery of my life ever. They laughed at $300. They had no idea what it was about to cost them. The next morning, I woke up calmer than I'd been in days. Anger had turned into focus. I printed the bylaws and spread them across my kitchen table, pages overlapping like a map. Outside, the lake was quiet, but in my head, everything was moving fast. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for certainty. If I was going to move forward, I needed to be absolutely sure. The clause wasn't obvious on a first read. It referenced another section, which referenced an amendment, which referenced a vote that had taken place years before I ever bought my house. That was the trick. Anyone skimming would miss it. But once I followed the chain, the meaning became clear. If the HOA failed to meet specific governance requirements for a defined period, authority didn't disappear. It transferred. That transfer wasn't symbolic. It was procedural. Control moved away from the board and into a different structure outlined in the original development agreement. A structure tied directly to property ownership and land use around the lake. And according to public records, those requirements hadn't been met in a very long time. I cross-checked everything. County filings. Meeting notices. Archived newsletters. I even drove to the records office and requested copies in person. Every document confirmed the same thing. The HOA had been operating on habit, not legality. They assumed no one would ever challenge them because no one ever had. By the third day, I contacted a lawyer. I didn't explain the story emotionally. I laid out facts. Dates. Clauses. Missteps. When I slid the papers across the desk, he didn't smile. He didn't nod. He went quiet. That silence told me more than words ever could. "This is interesting," he finally said. "Very interesting." He explained what triggering the clause would mean in real terms. Notices would have to be served. A formal declaration filed. A recalculation of authority across the lake community. It wouldn't be fast, and it wouldn't be subtle. Once started, it couldn't be ignored. I asked him one question. "Is it legal?" He didn't hesitate. "If what you've documented is accurate, it's not just legal. It's overdue." That night, I stood on my dock and looked across the water at the other houses. Lights flickered on one by one. Families. Retirees. People who trusted the HOA to manage things fairly. They didn't know what I knew. And soon, they wouldn't be able to avoid it. I drafted the first notice carefully. Neutral language. No accusations. Just facts. Compliance. Procedure. Transfer. When I finished, I realized my hands were steady. Whatever happened next, it was already bigger than me. The $300 violation was no longer the story. It was just the spark. The notice went out on a Tuesday morning. Certified mail. Digital copies. Public posting where required. I followed the process exactly as written, even where it felt excessive. Dates, timestamps, signatures. I wasn't giving them a single technical excuse to dismiss it. By noon, my phone started buzzing. At first, the messages were polite. Confused, even. A board member asked if there had been a mistake. Another suggested we talk privately and clear this up like adults. I didn't respond. Not because I was afraid, but because responding too soon would signal uncertainty. The clause required silence from my side until a specific response window closed. They didn't know that. I did. By the next day, the tone changed. Emails grew sharper. Someone accused me of harassment. Another warned that I was misinterpreting outdated language. That made me smile. If the language was outdated, they shouldn't have been using it to control the community for years. You don't get to cherry-pick which rules still apply. At the end of the response window, the HOA filed a rebuttal. It was rushed. Sloppy. They referenced sections that no longer existed and relied on assumptions instead of filings. My lawyer reviewed it once and shook his head. "They're arguing from memory," he said. "You're arguing from the record." The next step required a public disclosure to the lake community. That part made me nervous. Not because I was wrong, but because people hate disruption. I drafted the message carefully, explaining the situation without drama. No insults. No threats. Just a timeline of missed obligations and what the governing documents required as a result. The reaction was immediate. Neighbors I barely knew started reaching out. Some were skeptical. Some relieved. A few admitted they had always felt the HOA operated without transparency but didn't know how to challenge it. What surprised me most was how many people asked the same question: why hasn't anyone noticed this before? The answer was simple. Because noticing takes effort. And effort threatens comfort. At the emergency HOA meeting, the board looked different. No smiles. No confidence. Just tension. They tried to regain control by calling for a vote, but my lawyer stopped them cold. Without proper authority, Any vote they took would be meaningless. The room went quiet when that sank in. For the first time since I bought the lake house, I wasn't being spoken to as a problem. I was being treated as a variable they hadn't accounted for. As the meeting ended, one board member pulled me aside and whispered, "You didn't have to do all this over $300. I looked at him and answered honestly. This stopped being about money the moment you left. The weeks that followed felt unreal. The HOA board tried to project calm, but cracks were everywhere. Notices were delayed. Statements contradicted each other. Meetings were postponed without explanation. Every delay worked in my favor, because the clause didn't require perfection from me. It required continued failure from them. And failure was something they were very good at. My lawyer filed the formal declaration with the county. Once it was recorded, the shift in authority became more than theory. It became public record. That was the moment the lake community truly woke up. People don't ignore things once they're stamped, filed, and searchable. What had been gossip turned into concern, and concern turned into questions the board couldn't answer. Neighbors started attending meetings in numbers I'd never seen before. Not angry mobs, just curious homeowners who wanted clarity. The board tried to control the narrative, claiming the issue was under review, but that phrase stopped working once documents started circulating. Screenshots of bylaws. Highlighted clauses. Missed deadlines. Facts don't spread quietly, but they spread quickly. One afternoon, I received a letter from the HOA's attorneys. It was aggressive, filled with warnings and implications. Lawsuits. Damages. Responsibility. My lawyer read it, smiled faintly, and said, "They're posturing." He drafted a response that was half the length and twice as effective. It didn't argue emotion. It invited compliance. And it reminded them, politely, that intimidation doesn't override recorded law. The pressure began to fracture the board from the inside. 2 members resigned within days, citing personal reasons. Another stopped showing up altogether. Without a quorum, their ability to function eroded even further. Every resignation strengthened the clause's effect, accelerating the transfer of control outlined in the documents. What surprised me most was how quiet the lake became. Not physically, but socially. The usual chatter died down as people waited to see what would happen next. No one wanted to pick the wrong side. Power, once questioned, makes everyone cautious. Then the HOA made their biggest mistake. They attempted to levy a new fine against another homeowner, as if nothing had changed. That single action triggered a response from the county clerk's office. An inquiry. A request for authority verification. Suddenly, this wasn't just me versus the HOA. It was the system asking them to prove they still existed as they claimed. They couldn't. When the confirmation letter arrived, it was short and devastating. Until compliance was restored, the board's enforcement powers were suspended. All enforcement. Across the entire lake community. The laughter was long gone. In its place was silence, paperwork, and a realization they couldn't escape. With enforcement officially suspended, the lake community entered unfamiliar territory. For the first time in years, there were no warning letters taped to doors, no threatening emails about compliance, no surprise fines appearing in mailboxes. People didn't celebrate. They watched. When authority collapses suddenly, uncertainty rushes in to fill the space. The HOA board tried to save face. They sent a carefully worded update claiming the situation was temporary, a procedural misunderstanding. But by then, homeowners had learned how to read. They compared statements with documents. They asked questions at meetings. And they didn't accept vague answers anymore. That was when the clause reached its next phase. According to the original development agreement, once the board lost enforcement authority, interim control shifted to a land-based trustee model. It sounded abstract until people realized what it meant. Decisions about shared property, lake access, and infrastructure no longer flowed through the HOA. They flowed through ownership rights tied directly to the land itself. And I owned a critical portion of that land. Not the houses. Not the docks. The underlying parcels that connected them. Easements. Access corridors. Utility routes. Pieces everyone used but no one thought about. Pieces that had been quietly bundled with my lake house purchase years ago, dismissed as standard paperwork. My lawyer explained it simply. You don't own the neighborhood, he said. But you now sit at the center of how it functions. That distinction mattered. I didn't want control for ego. I wanted stability. So instead of acting unilaterally, I called for a community meeting. Not an HOA meeting. A neighborhood meeting. Voluntary. Transparent. Open. The turnout shocked everyone. People asked real questions. About budgets. About maintenance. About what had gone wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. For the first time, decisions were discussed instead of announced. The mood wasn't angry. It was relieved. The former board members sat quietly in the back. No authority. No microphones. Just homeowners like everyone else. One of them avoided my eyes entirely. Another looked exhausted, like someone who had finally realized how heavy unchecked power can become. Over the following days, temporary committees formed. Maintenance continued. Services resumed under direct contracts. Life around the lake didn't fall apart. It improved. Without fear-driven enforcement, people cooperated instead of complied. Then the final notice arrived. The county confirmed that unless the HOA restructured fully and lawfully within a fixed window, permanent authority realignment would be recorded. Not just suspension. Replacement. $300 had turned into a deadline that could reshape the entire lake community forever. As the deadline approached, tension settled over the lake like a low fog. Everyone felt it, even if they didn't talk about it openly. The former HOA board scrambled to regain legitimacy, calling emergency consultations, hiring new legal counsel, and sending out letters that sounded apologetic one day and defensive the next. Consistency was gone. Trust was worse. Behind the scenes, their lawyers attempted a reset. New bylaws. New elections. New promises. But the problem wasn't presentation. It was timing. The clause didn't care about intent. It cared about history. Years of missed filings, improper enforcement, and unchecked authority couldn't be erased with a last-minute makeover. I stayed deliberately quiet. That was the hardest part. Every instinct told me to explain, to reassure, to guide the conversation. But silence was strategic. Any move that looked like influence could be framed as manipulation. The documents spoke for themselves. Let them. Neighbors began organizing independently. Not rebelliously, but responsibly. Maintenance schedules were shared. Lake access rules were agreed upon collectively. Informal systems replaced formal threats, and surprisingly, they worked. People respected boundaries more when they helped set them. One afternoon, a former board member showed up at my door. He didn't bring paperwork. He didn't bring anger. Just exhaustion. He admitted they never expected anyone to challenge them, let alone succeed. We thought people needed us, he said quietly. Turns out, we just needed accountability. That moment stayed with me. When the deadline hit, the county clerk issued the final determination. The HOA had failed to re-establish lawful authority within the required window. The realignment became permanent. Control over shared governance transferred exactly as outlined in the original development agreement. Clean. Legal. Irreversible. The announcement rippled through the community. There was no cheering. No victory lap. Just a collective exhale. Uncertainty had ended. Something new, something fairer, could finally begin. I received messages from neighbors thanking me, though I never felt like a hero. I had simply read what others ignored. I had taken the rules seriously when those in charge treated them as suggestions. The lake looked the same that evening. Water calm. Houses glowing at dusk. But the atmosphere was different. Lighter. Quieter in the right way. Power had shifted, not into new hands, but back where it belonged. All because someone laughed at a $300 notice. They thought it was small. They thought it was harmless. They thought no one would push back. They were wrong. 7. Life around the lake didn't transform overnight, but the absence of fear was noticeable immediately. Without warning letters or sudden penalties, people began talking to each other again. Small issues were handled face to face. A dock repair. A shared pathway. Noise after dark. Conversations replaced citations, and cooperation replaced compliance. A temporary governance framework was drafted by a group of volunteers, reviewed by council, and shared openly. Every line was discussed. Nothing was hidden. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. The lake community started to feel like a neighborhood instead of a checklist. The former HOA board attempted one last appeal. They claimed the realignment harmed property values and destabilized management. The county rejected it within days. The ruling was clear. Authority lost through neglect cannot be reclaimed through complaint. The documents had spoken. The window had closed. What surprised many people was how quickly property confidence returned. Buyers didn't disappear. If anything, interest increased. Transparency has value. Predictability has value. People would rather live somewhere governed by rules everyone understands than by power no one questions. I stepped back deliberately. My role was never meant to be permanent. I declined leadership positions and avoided influence where possible. The clause didn't make me king. It made me a catalyst. And catalysts don't stay in the reaction. One evening, I walked the shoreline as the sun dipped low, casting long reflections across the water. I passed homes where lights were on and laughter drifted through open windows. The same place. A different feeling. I realized something then. Control hadn't flipped to me. It had flipped away from arrogance. Weeks later, a neighbor asked if I regretted not just paying the $300 and moving on. I thought about it carefully before answering. Paying would have been easier. Quieter. Safer. But it would have confirmed something dangerous. That authority can mock fairness and expect silence in return. Rules matter only when someone is willing to hold them to account. The HOA's laughter had been a symptom, not the cause. The cause was complacency. The belief that no one would read the fine print, follow the steps, or push back calmly and legally. That belief cost them everything they thought they controlled. As the lake settled into its new rhythm, I felt no triumph. Just clarity. Power doesn't vanish when challenged. It redistributes. And when it redistributes correctly, everyone breathes easier. All because someone decided to laugh at a small notice instead of respecting it. Months passed, and the lake community found its balance. What once felt fragile now felt routine in the best way. Schedules were posted publicly. Decisions were recorded and shared. Disagreements still happened, but they no longer felt threatening. Without a single board holding unchecked authority, responsibility spread naturally among the people who lived there. The old HOA structure officially dissolved after the final filings were completed. No dramatic announcement. No farewell letter. Just a quiet update in the county records. An institution that once seemed permanent ended with paperwork, the same way it had ruled. I watched from a distance as new systems matured. Committees rotated leadership. Budgets were voted on openly. Lake maintenance improved because people understood exactly where the money went. Transparency didn't slow things down. It sped them up. When trust exists, efficiency follows. Occasionally, someone new would move into the neighborhood and ask about the HOA. The answer was always calm and simple. We don't have one like that anymore. No bitterness. No pride. Just fact. And when they asked why, the story was told carefully, without exaggeration. A small fine. A rule ignored. A clause followed. What struck me most was how the culture changed. The fear of punishment vanished, and in its place grew a sense of ownership that felt genuine. People cared because it was theirs, not because they were afraid of consequences. That difference mattered more than any bylaw. I kept the original $300 notice in a drawer. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides in routine, in laughter, in the assumption that no one will challenge it. The moment someone does, everything shifts. One afternoon, I ran into a former HOA board member at the marina. He nodded politely. No hostility. Just acceptance. He admitted the experience changed how he viewed leadership. We forgot we were stewards, he said. We acted like owners. That sentence stayed with me. The lake reflected the sky that evening, smooth and uninterrupted. Boats moved slowly, unhurried. Children laughed along the shore. Nothing about the scene suggested conflict or control. And that was the point. Good governance disappears into the background. Bad governance demands attention. Looking back, it was never about flipping control for its own sake. It was about restoring balance where arrogance had tipped the scales. The clause didn't create chaos. It corrected it. $300 could have ended the story early. Instead, it revealed something larger. A system built on neglect will always collapse when faced with patience and precision. And sometimes, the quietest words in a document carry the loudest consequences. In the end, nothing about the lake looked different to an outsider. The houses still lined the water. The docks still stretched into the blue. The sunset still arrived on schedule. But for those who lived there, everything had changed in a way that couldn't be measured from the shore. The story spread slowly beyond the community. Not as gossip, but as caution. Realtors mentioned it quietly. Lawyers referenced it carefully. Other HOAs nearby began reviewing their own documents, suddenly aware that confidence without compliance is fragile. Power invites scrutiny the moment someone stops being afraid of it. People often ask me what the clause actually said. I never quoted it word for word. The language mattered less than the lesson. Rules aren't decorations. They aren't suggestions. They're contracts. And contracts don't care about tone, tradition, or laughter. They care about adherence. I thought about that often when I sat by the water in the evenings. How close I'd come to dismissing the notice as an annoyance. How easy it would have been to pay and forget. That path would have preserved comfort, but it would have rewarded carelessness. Silence always does. The former HOA never recovered its authority, but the people did. They learned that participation matters. That oversight matters. That leadership is temporary and accountability permanent. Those lessons outlived any board or document. I eventually sold the lake house. Not out of bitterness or triumph, but completion. The chapter had closed. When I handed over the keys, I also handed over a binder containing every relevant document, every filing, every amendment. The new owner deserved clarity, not mystery. As I drove away for the last time, I didn't feel victorious. I felt lighter. The story had never been about winning. It had been about correcting something quietly broken before it harmed more people. Sometimes, systems fail not because they're challenged, but because they're never questioned. Laughter becomes a shield. Routine becomes armor. And then one small moment cracks it all open. $300 was the spark. The fire was years of neglect. And the result wasn't destruction, but recalibration. A reminder that power borrowed from rules must obey them fully or give way. I keep that notice still. Folded. Unremarkable. A piece of paper that proved something important. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need force to shift control. You just need patience, precision, and the courage to read what others ignore. They laughed because they thought it was small. They were wrong.